A Critique of Hume's Understanding of Induction in Light of Thomistic Thought by Nathan Rausch and Mary Leahy for Dr. Yates' class on Logic and Epistemology. Philosopher David Hume was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and lived from 1711 to 1776. He is considered a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he is an empiricist. Empiricism is the philosophical school which holds that there are no innate ideas in the human mind, and all knowledge comes from sense experience. Empiricists claim that empirical evidence gathered from the senses is key in the formation of ideas. His most notable work is an inquiry concerning human understanding. According to Hume, there are two types of knowledge the human mind can come to. Hume writes, "All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, which are discoverable by the mere operation of thought. Matters of fact, which are the second object of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is our evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. Knowledge that comes from a relation of ideas is infallible because logically it cannot admit of being other than it is. In other words, knowledge of this type is a necessary truth. If we deny these relations, self-contradictions occur. Knowledge from relation of ideas is considered, as Kant would later name, a priori knowledge because we can know them through mere operation of the mind. For example, the knowledge that a triangle has 3 sides, or that 2 plus 2 equals 4, qualifies as this kind of knowledge. The second kind of knowledge are matters of fact. As opposed to knowledge from relations of ideas, matters of fact can never be known with certainty. To deny these facts is not to assert a contradiction. They are considered a posteriori knowledge because we synthesize this knowledge with the data from our sensory impressions. We use these matters of fact as material for inductive reasoning. Induction is the practice of drawing general conclusions based on particular experiences. From our sensory observations of a particular thing, we assume that all particular things of this kind, which have not been observed, will exist or function in the same way. All laws of nature which we use to plan our lives around and which scientists use to examine the world are predicated on this process of inductive reasoning. For example, in the past, I observed that the sun rises and sets, and today I observe that the sun rose and set, and thus I presume it will continue to rise and set each day in the future. In coming to know these matters of fact, we must use our faculties of mind. For Hume, our faculties allow us to understand impressions, and from those impressions, synthesize ideas. Impressions are merely the simple, sensory data that we take in from the world. For example, color, heat and cold, loudness and silence, and sweetness and savoriness. Hume explains, by the term impression then, I mean all our more lively perceptions, when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire, or will. Ideas, on the other hand, are of a much weaker, less immediate nature than impressions, and they are commensurately more confusing and abstract. This is because ideas are derivative of impressions. We synthesize our impressions to form ideas. For example, the idea of a blue man is a synthesis of the impression of blue and man. Hume writes, "All our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions." We move from impressions to ideas through the functions or natural relations of mind. Hume observes, "To me there appear to be only 3 principles of connection among ideas, namely resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause or effect. For our purposes, we need not fully explain Hume's understanding of resemblance and contiguity. A nominal definition of each will be sufficient, and then we will present a more in-depth explanation of the relations of mind known as cause and effect. The relation of mind known as resemblance is the function by which a subject discerns a similarity between one experience and another, and thus acts in light of the first experience. We use contiguity when we observe that particular objects are temporally and spatially together, and we see an event take place. Most crucially, our minds perceive cause and effect when we identify a relation between two objects to attempt to understand knowledge that is not immediately demonstrable to our sense impressions. It is only our mind's attempt to relate impressions that are temporally and spatially conjoined. For example, when I put a pot of water over heat of a certain temperature, the water boils. Thus, I think I understand a causal relationship between that heat and boiling water. With resemblance and contiguity, we have impressions of what an object is like or where and when objects are together, respectively. But we never can be certain of a necessary connection manifestly in the relation of cause and effect. We can only see that one event follows another. Hume explains, when we look about us towards external objects and consider the operation of causes, we are never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection, any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. The aforementioned inability of the human mind to certainly comprehend necessary connection with respect to cause and effect necessarily creates problems with the assumed certainty of inductive reasoning. According to Hume, because we cannot have certain knowledge of the true cause of effects, we cannot use inductive reasoning to come to certain knowledge. We can only rely on past experience for a probable and uncertain prediction about an effect that may occur. To justify the laws of nature and justify induction, we must use inductive reasoning. For Hume, this is circular reasoning. Thus, we can only have contingent truths, i.e., matters of fact. Hume expresses this assertion when he says that the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. We should in vain, therefore, attempt to demonstrate the falsehood. Hume's skepticism of our understanding of causality leads him to question the principle of causality and thereby question the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of causality claims both that a contingent event cannot occur without a cause and that a contingent being cannot come to exist without a cause. Hume's understanding of the distinction between knowledge from relations of idea and matters of fact allows him to posit that we can imagine an object without a cause without imagining a contradiction. Therefore, it is justifiable to say that to deny the principle of causality is not against reason. From this denial of the principle of causality, Hume consequently denies the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason, found in the ancients in part, and more fully in Hume's predecessor, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, asserts that everything that exists has a sufficient reason for its existence. Hume is comfortable denying this principle because he holds that we do not need to have an extrinsic necessary cause for things. And if we say there is causation for certain things, it lies in the material existence of the parts of an object.
However, Professor Alexander Pruss provides a critique on Hume's epistemology as it relates to his views on causation and inductive reasoning in his work titled The Principle of Sufficient Reason, a Reassessment. In this work, he starts by first defining the principle of sufficient reason, otherwise referred to as the PSR, as the principle that states, everything that is the case must have a reason why it is the case. Necessarily, every true or at least contingently true proposition has an explanation. The PSR directly entails a principle of causality that, as mentioned previously, claims both that a contingent event cannot occur without a cause and that a contingent being cannot come to exist without a cause. Hume's epistemology, however, denies that there is a connection between cause and effect that we have access to, and this is where the heart of the disagreement is between Hume and scholars such as Alexander Pruss. Since Hume argues that there is not a single instance in which we can point to a connection between cause and effect, we must critique his reasoning as charitably as possible to discern why or why not this is the case. Hume asserts the principle that anything thought to exist can likewise be thought not to exist, supplemented with the additional qualification that everything other than the denied item can be thought to continue existing. Essentially, Hume argues that we can imagine some object coming to exist from nothing without it being absurd to do so, and therefore we cannot know whether everything has a cause or not. This also can be shown mathematically to be logical. However, therein lies the key to understanding where Hume goes wrong here. For Hume's assertion that we can imagine something coming from nothing is not making an epistemic or causal claim that it is possible, but rather just a claim that it is possible logically. Some things that have been shown to be logically possible in this narrow sense can also be shown to be metaphysically impossible, though, as demonstrated by Professor Gödel. The claim made of the PSR and the principle of causality is one of metaphysical necessity, and thus Hume showing the logical possibility of something coming into existence from nothing does not give him reason to deny the PSR. Another important part of Hume's understanding of causation is seen when he says, "Did I show you the particular causes of each individual in a collection of 20 particles of matter, I should think it very unreasonable should you afterwards ask me, what was the cause of the whole 20? This is sufficiently explained in explaining the cause of the parts." Hume asserts that if we can explain each of the particles individually, we will have a complete explanation for them, which is formalized in the Hume-Edwards-Campbell principle that states that if one has explained each conjunct of a proposition or each member of an aggregate, then one has explained the whole. By this assertion, Hume is denying that in order to have a full explanation for the piece of matter, that he would need to explain why the piece of matter exists at all. Scholars such as Proust take issue with this claim by first showing that it is false unless we add that the principle only holds in the special case where one of the explanations goes beyond the set of conjuncts, or at least one of the conjuncts is a self-explainer. In other words, we cannot say we have fully explained the particles unless the explanation references a cause outside the particles themselves, or one of the particles is shown to explain its own existence. If this condition is not met, then any explanation of the 20 particles will be viciously circular, which then begs the question as to what the explanation is for the causal circle. We can also consider the case of an infinite series of particles with particular causes based in one another, and this can be shown to similarly fail to provide a full explanation. If Hume's understanding of the causal relationships necessary to provide a full explanation for something is wanting, it then leads us to ask, what is Hume not accounting for? We need to go back to the roots of Hume's epistemology in order to identify this. Hume initially splits knowledge into two categories, one being relations of ideas and the other being matters of fact. As a reminder, for Hume, matters of fact are when the mind forms impressions based upon the sensory knowledge we take in from the world around us. Kenneth Gallagher, in his book, The Philosophy of Knowledge, points out that what Hume misses here is that we do not experience mere impressions or activities, we experience beings acting. Hume does not acknowledge the intrinsic connection between our sensory experiences and the beings which we encounter through them. As a consequence of this, he sees nothing which we can appeal to outside of the sensory experiences themselves, and disregards the notion of the nature or essence of a thing. Proust also states in his book that it is worth noting that Hume's own intuitions about the falsity of the CP or PSR might have been colored by his view of causation. If causation is nothing but constant conjunction, then the denial of the necessity of the CP is just the claim that a contingent event can happen that is not the second term in any constant conjunction. Once we acknowledge that things have a nature or essence, this can be referenced in the cause-effect relationship of the example earlier of boiling water on a stove. The cause-effect relationship between the two is not entirely based in pointing to a sequence of events, but rather in appealing to the nature of the materials in question. We may still struggle to apply this in every case of inductive reasoning because of the difficulty of identifying the nature of things, but all it takes is one instance to show that inductive reasoning can lead us to certain truth that is based on something more than just a sequence of events, as Hume claims. Hume's epistemological approach to causality puts him at odds with Aquinas as well, and we can immediately see the importance of this with respect to Aquinas' 5 ways. Acceptance of the PSR is closely connected to belief in a first cause, as we see when Proust says, "Indeed, despite some notable dissent, it now appears generally established that once one grants an appropriate version of the PSR, it follows that there is a necessary first cause of the cosmos, that is, of an aggregate of all contingent beings." St. Thomas himself, however, does not have specific arguments for the PSR or CP, but hints at this presupposition in his writings on essence and existence. We can also see that St. Thomas takes the CP for granted as a premise in his 5 ways of God's existence, because it is necessary to support them. The composition of essence and existence necessitating an explanation is something that St. Thomas takes for granted and Hume rejects. We can see how Hume's epistemology predetermines his rejection of the five ways, in a similar manner to the way the acceptance of the PSR seemingly predetermines an acceptance of them. Thus, we can see an example of how crucial epistemology can be to finding answers to some of the most important questions in our lives.